Alright, so you've seen us tear this down. Now we're going to go over the things that we need to do before we start assembling the head. As you can see, we have everything here, and let's start putting it together. So now we're at the point now we want to assemble the heads before we set them up on the block. So just for a breakdown, this is basically what you're going to be assembling here. We'll start with the head assembly itself. The things you want to check obviously are for a clean, straight surface for the valve cover, for the exhaust, and then most importantly for the head to block connection. And you can see we have this all cleaned up. Now what we did too is we had put a straight edge on this, and you can actually get them out of any automotive center. Someone will even loan them to you. But these straight edges are accurate to within a 1/2 thousandths of an inch. And you want to do a crisscross pattern and then a straight up pattern, and you want to basically look for any spots where you could see light if you hold a flashlight behind it. And what that does is tells you that at that point then the head would need to be reground. This one was in good shape. And the bottom line is you don't want to have it surfaced if you don't need to. Reason being is if it had already been surfaced and was within specs and you have it cut again, when you cut these and you cut too much off of them, because of the V pattern on the block, it draws the heads closer together. So what happens then is you may be able to get both the heads down, but when you put the lower intake manifold on, both holes aren't going to line up. They're now closer together and not where they should be in regard to the manifold. So keep that in mind. If you'd like, you can actually go on some of the forums that are out there and you can download a program called Rave, R-A-V-E, and that has the overhaul manual, which will give you a lot of the specs for how far you can cut the heads, your torque specs for all your bolts, and some of your assembly rundown beside our video. So all that information makes this a little bit easier. So again, we checked the surface, we looked, our surfaces are good, our bracket is on. And this is the driver's side head. You want to make sure your ground strap is on. Now one thing we want to check is the oil delivery holes that run oil up to the rockers, okay, the way they're mounted on top. And you'll see you got basically a small hole here. This is a 5/32 drill bit. We're just going to run that down. We want to make sure that one is nice and clear. That looks good. And this one we can feel some drag. And sure enough, we've got some sticky mung in there. So what we're going to do is take some brake clean and blow that out. On the same token, the coinciding openings in the rocker arms, you have your oil delivery holes feed a small chamber on the bottom of the rocker. And as you can see there, we get some buildup, actually quite a bit. And that can also cause a lowering of the oil pressure to the rockers, so we want to make sure that's open and clean. So we're going to clean those out. We're going to make sure those are open, and then the next step would be to get the exhaust manifold bolted on, so you know which manifold it is. On your left side head of the two manifolds, the single bolt, that single bolt will always point towards the front of the engine. So when you set the manifold on place, if that's up front, this is the correct manifold. Now we're going to show you something else in regard to the exhaust manifold gaskets. Proper positioning would be like so. Nope, sorry. Like so. Reason being is this cross piece here that connects the two ports is below the spark plug and the head bolt. Now as you can see, these can be mounted upside down. And should you make that mistake, you are now blocking off access to the head bolt and to the spark plug. So when you put these gaskets on, they should look like this, with that cross piece laying on the bottom. And then the front would be exactly the same. So from there, then we're going to put the exhaust manifold bolts on. Don't forget that you have spacers on these bolts. I've had this in this little tray soaking and penetrating oil just to get them lubed up. So these are going to be a 12mm 12 point. Don't forget, make sure you put your spacer. So it's going to be your gasket, your manifold, and your spacer. And then we'll lock those down good and tight. And then spark plugs. Now we find the champions seem to run the best in these 4.0, 4.6 engines, especially with the Bosch. So you're going to set your gap, which is also in the Rave I believe these are 35 to 42. Usually set them at about 35 because as they wear, they'll stay within the specifications. Now's a good time to install them because it's right here in front of you. You can lock them down. You don't want to make them too tight because basically you've got aluminum heads. You don't want to over tighten the plugs. They're going to take a lot of torque. Just want to make sure you snug them in. And then last but not least, and I always replace the studs. You'll see on the manifold that you're missing your 3 studs that go down through the catalytic converters. Reason being for that, in many cases, by the time you're doing an engine job on this, the threads are pretty well worn off. You might have even had to heat them up taking it out. Now, these are set so that you have 2 different length threads. The shorter end is going to go into the manifold, leaving the extended area and the barrel extended out. So we're going to just replace all those. And same thing, if you have a stud puller that'll lock on, that'll do a good job. If not, you can take a pair of needle nose vice grip and grab the barrel, don't grab the threads. Spin that on until essentially you don't see any more threads on the short end. Then you know it's fully seated. And that's pretty much it. So that at this point now, once we get everything cleaned off and together, we'll be ready to put the head on the engine. Alright, so here's our heads completed and put together. Exhaust manifold, spark plugs. The rockers are on but loose because they're going to come back off again anyway after we get the heads on. But they're there to assist in setting the heads in place, and you'll see why in a few minutes. The other thing I want to mention, here's your head gasket. You can see that on one side they apply some red sealer, and what you're going to look for is that word top. So that means that when you set this in place, this is the top side. This is what's going to be facing the head. And again, you can also recognize that by the red sealer. When you see that red sealer, you should be seeing that when you place it on the block. Now you also have a couple locating pins on the block, so you'll be able to actually set the head gasket and it'll stay in place when we lower the head onto it. Alright, so you see what I've done. Basically just run 2 rags underneath the rockers so that when I loop them under and come back up, I have a good handle. And threads, the bolts are in, you know, a good 5 or 6 threads. You want them in there a little bit. You want to make sure this doesn't come loose. Second thing I want to mention, always put a fender cover on because there's a good chance you could end up bopping into this. You don't want to hit the fender. You don't want to cause a dent. Just something else to work on later down the line. So what we're going to do then is just simply lift up on the head. I can lower it down in, set it in place. Only need to move it a little bit and it should pop right on. You have 2 locating pins on the block itself. One here and one in the back, and that's going to hold the head gasket in place as well. So everything will be lined right up, and then we can put some head bolts in and get things torqued in. So we got the head in place. The pins will hold that. It's not going to go anywhere. Taking the rockers back off, you just back off the 4 bolts. Set that to the side because it will eventually go back on. We got to put the lifters and the push rods in. So you'll notice that if you notice when you pulled it apart, you had 3 long head bolts in the top center, and then the rest, the remaining 7, are the shorter bolts. And there's your difference in length. So we're going to put one of the long bolts in the top, one of the short bolt in the bottom in the center, and then we're going to run the rest of the bolts, install them, and then just run them down so they're just touching when they're just touching the head. And then from that point, we'll torque them up according to specs. Now specs on these, we're going to be tightening them all to 15 foot-pounds. And then you're going to turn each one 90 degrees with a breaker bar and then wait about 10-15 minutes and then an additional 90 degrees. Now being on this case, we're starting with a new block, so we've got nice clean threads in the block for the head bolts. Should this be a used block and you're doing just the head gaskets, you want to make sure you run a thread chaser down each one of those holes. You want to get all corrosion, dirt, anything out of those. Sometimes it's even best if you have access to compressed air. Shoot a little solvent down in each hole and then blow it out with the air, holding a rag over it so obviously you don't get it in your face. And from that point, this way, you always want to start with clean threads. And then it's also recommended that before you run each head bolt in, what we're going to do is keep a little bit of oil, and we're just going to simply dip the end in those head bolts before we install them. And this way you'll end up with a much better torque rating. You're not fighting against any dirt or any buildup in those threads. They're going to thread in nice and easy. So once we get those 2 in, then it's essentially the same procedure for the rest of the head bolts. We're just going to run them in so they're just touching the head. So now that we get the head bolts snugged in, what we're going to do then before we torque up, I want to just run this by. Anytime you put a head or a manifold or even a pan, like a pan gasket or a transmission pan, anytime you tighten up something like that, you always start from the center. So you could do either top or bottom, doesn't matter, but you start in the center and then you simply work across and then in an outward spiral. In other words, so we do the bottom center, top center, then we can go to the left, do top and bottom. We're going to go over to the other side, bottom and then top, and then around to top to bottom, bottom to top. And that's the best way to torque up ahead. What that does is reduces distortion, you get a better lockdown on it, and then, believe it or not, may make for a better job. When you've done this once, you're going to wait a minute or two and then go around one more time just to make sure they're all evenly torqued. Alright, so I should have mentioned earlier, the head of these bolts are 5/8, which is basically the same thing as a spark plug socket. So I've used a swivel spark plug socket to run them in, especially in those back corners. It works very well. But now that we're going to go to the 90-degree twist, you're going to be getting into a much higher torque. So we're going to step up to 1/2-inch drive, 24-inch breaker bar with a 5/8 socket on the end. So we'll start in the middle and we'll go exactly 90 degrees, and you can plus or minus 10 degrees. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. There are gauges out there that are available that you can actually install before you put the bolt on or socket on, and it will show you at 90 degrees. But 90 degrees is pretty much just a straight angle. So what we'll do, see, like in this case, really can't get a good bite on anything where it's going to be easy to figure out 90. There we go. Alright, so essentially here's 0. So 90 degrees is we're going to run into where the bar should end up, actually just about perpendicular to the block. And we're essentially just going to do the same thing all the way around. The same thing, we're going to figure about where 90 degrees is. This time we're just right up against the firewall. Alright, and just to make it easier, because the hardest bolt to get at through this whole operation is this back head bolt, because we actually have to turn it to a specific torque. So we got a 5/8 deep 1/2-inch drive socket, swivel socket, so this way we can get in at an angle. And we're essentially going to set it up so that it will not only drop on, but set the square in an accessible point, and then we can figure out 90 degrees from there. So at this stage of the game, this is when it gets a little tough, because now we're going to do the final 90. We've waited about 10-15 minutes, we let things settle in on the first torque. Now with the additional 90, this is going to bring you up to over 100 foot-pounds in torque on an average. So what you may need to do when it gets real tight is add a cheater bar onto this. We're going to see if we can go the full 90 without having to add it. In this case, I think what we're going to do is, because 90 is going to put us past the firewall, we're going to go 45 and then pull this back and reset it and do the additional 45. So that's essentially the procedure for installing the head and torquing down on the head gaskets. Now we're just going to do passenger side, exact same process as we did on the driver's side. So next step is going to be to install the push rods and the rockers. Now what he did was we cleaned up these push rods. You want to put them on a nice smooth surface. You want to roll them just to make sure nothing is bent. You also want to check both ends, kind of run your thumbnail over it. If you have an error, you're going to just catch a little step at the bottom, but if it feels really rough or even sharp edged, you want to replace that push rod. So we have all 16 all cleaned up nice, and we've got the lifters in place, so we're going to go back over to that engine and set things up. Alright, first things first, and I've seen guys do this, these lifters come in and out of here fairly easy. look at that, making sure you're going to put that end facing up and not that end. I've seen it done. And you're just going to basically wiggle it'll seat in place. They're all pretty well oiled because they've been soaked. And you're going to go down through the hole, and you're going to set up all your push rods. Make sure you go through the guides. There's little holes there in the head that guide the top of the push rod. Alright, so we're going to set the rocker in place now. Remember, we're going to make sure you've got, here's your rounded area where your push rods are going to seat, and of course the flat lands end up on the valves. So we'll just set this gently in place. We want to get the bolts lined up. Now, you got to remember that right now, you're going to have, there's going to be some of these push rods are in the up position because the cam, they're riding directly on the cam, which is going to create spring pressure on the rocker arm. So when we tighten this down, we just want to go a little bit at a time until we seat the rocker down on the head. Then we'll put the torque wrench on it, and torque specs on these are 28 foot-pounds. Once we have the all these bolts seated, and we're just going to use a ratchet and a socket to seat them down, then we'll torque up the specs. So if you look, we got the rockers down in place. The rocker shaft, well, actually the lands are seated on the head. So now we don't have to worry about working against spring pressure. And the reason we did that was because you could possibly bend that rocker shaft. If you torque one end down and the other has spring pressure, it actually creates a force that can bend them. So now that they're seated, we'll start in the middle. We've got their torque wrench set at 28 foot-pounds. Do the two in the middle, and then we go to the outside. And we do it one more time just so that we know we have an even torque on all four bolts. Okay, that's pretty much it. So now we'll just do the same on the other side, and we'll have our rockers and push rods in place. So our next step is we're going to put the lower intake manifold on. To do so, you're going to grab the two end seals that come in your gasket set, your valley pan gasket, and then of course the intake. And basically what we've done is we cleaned this off so we get a nice smooth surface on both sides. And you're going to need a 3/8 drive torque wrench. Now you can use a long extension with a swivel end. I just happen to have this tool, just makes it a little bit easier. This is essentially a 13mm swivel on already built onto the extension. Gasket scraper in case you need a final cleanup. Of course, a ratchet to turn the extension on. Now this is a tool that's similar to what the factory calls for, and it makes it a lot easier to get to the bolts once you get things in place to torque them up. You're going to put this on the torque wrench. It's essentially a 13mm 12-point with 3/8 drive. Can be referred to as a crowfoot, sometimes socket extension. There's a number of different names for them, but this does make the job a lot easier. So what we do to start off is we're going to take some of the high tack, and we're going to put a little coating on both sides of the heads. Now I don't recommend using RTV on the gasket surfaces, though we are going to use some to seal up where you've got a couple different components, like where the head meets the block and where the front cover meets, but mostly just the two areas that where the head meets the blocks. You have 4 points. So we've done that. We're going to let that tack up a little bit, and then essentially we're going to take some of the RTV. Now right here you can actually see a little valley right where the head meets the block. What we want to do is we want to fill that with some RTV. This will help prevent oil weepage. And we'll let that set up for a few minutes and let it get a little tacky. So you'll notice the end seals basically conform to the block. So one side is fairly straight, the other has a curve to it, and you'll see that in the gasket as well. Plus on the end here you have a little wedge that drops down into that area that we RTV'd, so it's going to push some there. Now in the manual it tells you to apply, just put one little bead of RTV, but I usually do it twice down in that valley, and then I'll do it one more time over the top before we put the pan gasket on. So we got the two end seals in place, a little dab of RTV again on the corners just to give a little extra, basically just a little extra protection against an oil leak. We're going to set the pan in place so the bolt holes, you can look straight down, and then we'll push that down into place. Okay, the next are your two hold down plates. Now if you remember when we took this apart, we put this aside so that the two bolts that hold these down, they're a little different than the bolts that are in the rest of the block. So you want to make sure that you've put these aside. So we're going to very gently lower the intake sort of in place, but just a little ahead so we can reach in the back. And then you've got the fuel line, it's got to go on. And you want to make sure you hear that click once you got it on there. Okay. And we just lower this back a little bit. Now, if you look at the 10 bolts that go in this, 8 of them are all the same length, and there are 2 long ones, and they're going to go in the front here. And then once we get them all started, we're going to torque them down. Now the factory calls for a sequence to start with 7 foot-pounds, then all the way around again at 13 foot-pounds, and then a final tightening of 38. Most of your 3/8 drive torque wrenches are not going to go down to 7 pounds. So I usually set mine at 10, and then I'll do 20, and then we do 38 all the way around. And even then we'll let it sit for about 15-20 minutes and then go 38 one more time around just to make sure everything's torqued down nice and tight and the gasket's been compressed. So just like we mentioned with the heads, anytime you torque down a head or a manifold, anything like that, to reduce the amount of distortion, we're going to start from the center and then work our way around into a spiraling outward pattern until we've torqued them all. As I said, we're going to do in different we'll do 10, 20, and then 38. And then after the 38, we're going to wait about 10-15 minutes and then do 38 again just to make sure everything's down and tightened properly. Alright, so before we put the valve covers on, we have an actual bolt that goes up into the back of the head that runs through that bracket right there, and what that does is holds the harness in place right about there. So we need to attach that, and then we also need to attach the ground strap. And if you'll notice on this, you'll see a green wire with a loop. That's also going to go to that ground post. Alright, so now's the point you definitely want to plug in. This is for the crank sensor. You're going to see the tab right here that latches on to that little notch. So essentially that's the wrong way, that's the right way. When you plug this together, you should hear a little click when that locks in. And then there's a bracket on the back that you're not going to be able to see in this video that this hooks into to keep it from banging around in there. This is a really bad connector to try to get to. Alright, so next is going to be your valve covers. Now the first thing I do, and if you notice there's a rag sitting on top of the intake manifold, we want to cover those holes. You're going to be handling small bolts. God forbid you drop one and it goes down one of those ports. You'll fish it out, you'll end up taking the intake back off to get at it. So we put a rag over there as protection, and then what we've done is we've prepped the valve covers. We've shot high tack on the inside areas of both valve covers and on the areas of the gasket itself that will lay on the surface. Reason for that is that when it gets good and tacky, we let it sit for about 15 minutes. You put your gasket on the valve cover, it's going to stick and it's going to hold to it. Otherwise, trying to hold on to that and keep it from falling in and unsettling is just a royal pain. So this way, gasket's stuck to the valve cover, we run our bolts down, we line it up so much easier. Now remember that these bolts are 8mm 12 point, so you want to make sure you pull that tool out and clean the bolts up a little bit. Just give them a little shoot down with some brake clean or whatever. Just get them a little cleaner before you install them. Alright, so just as a note, there's a groove cut on one side of the valve cover gasket, and then one side is actually relatively flat except for one raised rib. So that's the area that's going to make contact with the head. So the grooved area actually seats all the way around in the valve cover. Make sure that all four of your spacers are present, they didn't drop out of the gasket. And then we'll get them relatively close, and then essentially put the 4 bolts in. And remember, you've got the 2 short on the inside part of the engine and the 2 long on the outside closer to the exhaust manifold. So we're going to do here's your passenger side first that has your oil filled tube. Now remember, this is a Bosch engine where your oil filled tube is on the passenger side. Of course, on a GEMS engine, you're going to find it on the driver's side. And all we did was just basically hold up the wiring harness, sneak that in, and then visually give a look at where the bolts line up, and you can kind of wiggle it back and forth and you'll feel one of the little bolts kind of drop down in there. What we're going to do is then we'll get them all started. Now the book says to torque to 2.5 foot-pounds. You're going to need a very small, almost like a dial type 1/4 inch drive torque wrench if you want to torque it up. It's 2.5 pounds, do all 4, and then you go up to 6 pounds as the final torque on all 4 bolts. So the one side's torqued in place, and then simply we're just going to do the exact same on the other side. And then before you start tightening bolts down, because of all this wiring and whatnot, you just want to make sure you don't have a wire pinched between the valve cover and the head anywhere in the front or the back. That will lead to problems later on down the line. So same thing with this side. We got some wires hanging around, so we want to make sure that we don't get them caught up in the valve cover. And that's pretty much to it on those. Alright, so there we have the valve covers in place. We got the lower intake in place. At this point, we can grab the main harnesses. We can kind of set them in place. Now, in most cases, when you first took this apart, you had basically tie straps that went into these 4 locations. So of course they get brittle, they fall apart. You try to open them up, they break. So you can do it one of 2 ways. You can actually wire tie it directly, just loop under and wire tie it, or I know a lot of automotive centers have the wire ties with what they call a little Christmas tree attached to them, and that Christmas tree will pop right into those holes and wire tie the harness in place, and that's what we're going to do with this. But this way at least, we'll pull the harness out. You'll also notice that there is one more green wire on this. Now, if you have like a 2001 and later, you probably aren't going to find these green wires. I think this was a 2000. But you've seen this on the early Disco 2s. Don't see it so much on the later. So if you don't see the green wires, don't panic. It's not that they're missing. They're just on that particular design. They're not used. So don't worry about that. And the rest of it, this harness will go down the side of the bracket. All we're really thinking about right now is we're going to put the main harness back in its place, and then we're going to plug in all the injectors. And then this small bolt right here on the fuel rail is going to be the bolt we're going to run out, and then we're going to attach that green wire right here for that ground. Disco. This is for the O2 sensor. It's actually going to go around the back. Okay, there's O2 sensor. This should be the injector. Where's the O2 sensor wire here? This is for the coil. That's for the coil. This is for the idle air control. Now the one wire you want to be concerned with, this wire is for the knock sensor. This is going to run all the way down and underneath. We just want to make sure we get that down there, because once we get the bracket and the alternator in place, or I'm sorry, the power steering pump in place. We don't want to pinch that wire. We want to make sure we put that in a good spot. All right. Bingo. Okay, that's good for now. And then as we go along, we'll be plugging everything else in. Alright, so at this point now we're back underneath the vehicle. We've got to get a few things connected yet. Now that one harness that has the lead for the starter wire, and for the knock sensor on the right hand side, we got to sneak that through a hole that is on the upper back side of the mount so that it comes through to just above the starter. So you got, here's the end of your starter connection. This is going to go onto this nut here. There's a small spade push-in right over the top of this stud and nut. That's for your S wire. That'll be this lead right here. And then you also have your connector that you're going to push in. You're going to click into your knock sensor right here. Then once we've done that, then we can sneak the heat shield in there and get that popped in place before we put the exhaust on. So getting the shield back up in there is sort of a bit of a magic trick. So just watch. Make sure you spin it around. Go through the hole. Then we go towards the back of the starter a bit so that we can get this bracket tucked up into the motor mount. Alright, now we work on trying to get, there's a tab on the end of this that drops into a hole which will help line up. And just got to work it back and forth until we find it. There we go. Alright, and that puts that in place. So, then if you have a mirror, what you can do is actually look up inside the mount and see if the hole's lined up or not. And once we determine it isn't or it isn't, turn it the way we need to turn it to get it to line up. Alright, so this is what the finished product should look like. This clip is locked around the solenoid. Your wiring is protected from the heat shield, and then the front bolt is in and locked in place, so this is good and solid, not going anywhere. So now we just quickly, we're going to look to the other side, and here we have the other knock sensor. We've plugged that in, and you'll notice that this loop lines right up with this hole right here. And so what we're going to do is go find the bolt, put the bolt in there, and then that'll lock that one piece of wire right there in place to keep it secure, and then we can put the exhaust back up in place. So now we're ready to put the exhaust up in place. You've got to get your 2-hole gasket up in there, and usually can push it up in place. I always like to start on the driver's side. It leaves me some flexibility on the passenger side. We're not going to run the nuts up tight initially. We just want to get them up in place. And then the fun part is essentially getting up in there to get the gasket on. This is actually sometimes a little easier from up top. Let's see if we can get that on there. It says we're just going to lay the gasket right over the opening. We'll line up the holes. Alright, so we're going to hook the exhaust up. We find it's a lot easier to get to this passenger side setup than from underneath because you got the drive shaft and everything else in the way. So we're just going to sneak down in there and we're going to slide the gasket up over the studs so we can raise that up. And it's going to take it'll take a little doing, but it will go. And we got 1. 2 and 3, and then you can just raise the exhaust up. You have to reach down in, pull up on the exhaust and slide the studs over. With one arm hold it up, and the other we're going to just put one nut on to help support it. Alright, so we've got that side hooked up, basically just got the 3 bolts, and I just want to make note, don't forget, now's a good time to plug in that O2 sensor and then tuck the wire in back behind the right side head, and that'll keep it out of the way of the exhaust. Alright, so just to give you a shot what we've done on the passenger side, you're going to leave the nuts loose, you got to allow for some slack, and now we're going to pop the driver's side on. Alright, so basically at this point now we've got the 6 nuts in on the exhaust. We're going to run them up, we got them completely tight. As far as torque specs, because of the long extension you need to get up there, a torque wrench isn't going to be accurate anyway, so you just want to essentially just get them good and tight. And then don't forget to plug in your O2 sensor connector on the driver's side, and we're going to tuck that back in behind the bracket. So next what we're going to do is we'll get these transmission coolant lines back up in place. And you're going to have to do a little, there'll be a little pushing and pulling, but we essentially need to twist it, get this one up into this upper clip, the lower one into the lower clip, and then we'll show you where the other one goes. Alright, so we're going to install the bracket now that supports the AC compressor and the power steering pump. You want to make sure, if you have an oil cooler equipped vehicle, you want to make sure that the one line for the oil cooler underneath is back in behind the bracket. Also your wire going down to your knock sensor, you want to make sure that's clear. Then basically you're going to set it up on that stud that's on the front of the head, and that's going to come through this hole right in top of the power steering pump. And we'll just slide that on. Again, double check your wire, make sure it's not pinched in there. And we'll put the top bolt on. You'll feel the thread. They line right up. Alright, so we'll put the other 2 bolts on, and then we have the nut that goes on the stud and the single bolt up top. And then we're just going to run those in tight. Just quickly before I run them in, just to show you with the bolts out where their locations are, the nut and the single bolt up top. This is a 10mm head. These are all going to be 13. And just going to set them up good and tight. Okay, one thing I'm going to mention about this oil cooler. The one line that we snuck in behind the bracket obviously attaches down underneath and gets locked down. But to put it in the right position, what we're going to need to do is, we don't want to set it up on this bracket right away. We're going to leave this off. We got to get underneath. We're going to essentially put the other end of the tube up into its location by the filter. Leave that nut loose. Then get back up here, set the bolt up in this, so now the hose is in its proper position. There's no tension on any of the parts. And then we go back down, torque the nut that secures it to the oil filter housing, and then back up to tighten this one. Alright, so what we're going to do next is we're going to hook up the upper, these are the lines for the heater hoses for your heating system. I'm going to move that out of the way, and then put a little, replace this O-ring, and then put a little Vaseline on there so it slips in. This way it won't pinch it as we go in. It's kind of a tight fit, but it'll go. Alright, so next I'm going to show, it's already connected, but just to remind you, we're going to connect, you got a black connector here, and that's going to go to the cam sensor. Don't forget it, because it's kind of out of sight. It's underneath the water pump and you don't see it, so you don't want to forget connecting that. You're going to need that so you can start the vehicle. Then you also got your oil pressure sender right here. We've connected those. And now what we're going to do is put the other line on for the oil cooler. Don't forget, got to make sure you put your new O-ring on. Make sure that can spin. Alright, so now I'll show you. We put the lower hose in place. You have the one down tube, goes into the small opening The long neck is what attaches to the water pump, and then the short loop, this goes to the angled upward outlet of the thermostat. Okay, just so you have a note, top of the thermostat has two outlets. You have one that goes up at an angle and one that comes straight up. The one at an angle is what's going to get down to the lower hose. This one's going to go to the upper hose. We'll show you that when we get to that point. So now we're just going to squeeze the clamps on, get those into place. You can see we got our electrical connections in place, and we have this hosed in. And now the upper hose, this has got a short bolt that goes into the bottom, and that's been installed and tightened up. So then we're going to be ready to put that last bracket in. Alright, so let's get that bracket down in place. As you can see, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 bolts that run through. So here's the lower on the inside. It's an easy one to see. And this way we can line that up and get that started. And that'll make lining up the other 3 that much easier. Okay, next is going to be the cooling tube. You can see we've got this torqued in place. As I say, hoses on. We've got some stuff here that eventually is going to get bolted to this bracket. Right now we just need to get these on. So the tube essentially is tucked in right in the front of the intake manifold. You've got an O-ring on the back. You want to make sure you put a new O-ring there. We're going to put a little Vaseline on that. And then just to get things started, we'll put one bolt in there. We'll need about a 6 or 8 inch extension and a 10mm socket. The reason we put this on after the brackets because there's a support bracket right here that bolts to the alternator support, so you need that in place before you can put this tube in. So now it's just a matter of we put that one bolt in there, and then we're going to put one in the support bracket to support it. Alright, so we put a bolt here in the support bracket, so now this will just hold it in place, and we can sneak in underneath and install these other bolts. Alright, and now for the fun part. In their infinite wisdom, Land Rover puts the ignition coils buried back behind the upper plenum. So in other words, if we put the plenum on, it'd be almost impossible to put this on. First off, you can't even get to the bottom bolts once the plenum's in place, and you can't really tighten them until you put the upper bolts in. So what we normally do is we will lay this in place. We'll put the 2 bottom bolts in, and we're just going to snug them and then back them off just a little bit, enough to give a little bit of movement. The reason being is when we put the upper plenum on, that has to slide underneath these holes, so we've got to have some movement in there so that we can line them up, and you are going to use the top bolts to secure this in place. Alright, so what we're going to do, we're going to drop this into place, but before we go trying to put the bolts in place, what we're going to do is we're going to connect. We have the 2 electrical connectors. There's one and there's the other, and each one of these gets plugged into each side. This powers this side coil, this powers this side, and then basically one coil will power 4 cylinders, and each coil pack has actually 2 individual coils built into it. The other thing what we're going to do is before we even grab those little bolts, we're going to put a rag over the top here, because God forbid we drop one down in the hole. It will not be fun fishing it out. Alright, so we got both the holes lined up. We've got one started on one side. Now as you can see, these are hard to get at. So if you put a little dab of RTV, or you can even use grease, what we're going to do is put that on that socket, and that's going to hold that bolt so we can sneak it down in there. A little patience so we can get it started, and then we're going to do the same we did with the other one. We'll run it down, snug it in, and then just basically back it off about a half a turn just to allow enough slack so it'll wiggle so we can get those top bolts in. Alright, so now we're going to put the plug wires in. Now you'll notice most of the plug wire sets, even aftermarket for these, are numbered. You can see here's number 1, number 3, number 5, number 7. So there's 1, 3, 5, 7, 2, 4, 6, 8. Same thing on the other side. So we're going to just start plugging these in. And what I do is I like to give a little shot of silicone in each one. For one, makes it go on easier, adds a little extra protection to the boot, and this way you feel the distinct set in when you put the boot on the plug, you should actually kind of feel it click in. And then just put that in your holder right there. All right, so that's 7. That's number 3 is number 5. It's going to go in the middle right here. I can actually hear that click. Number 3. Number 1. Pop that there. And there. Then we'll just do the same thing to the other side there. Alright, so now we've got that all set up in the back. We're going to put the upper plenum on. Don't forget your steel gasket. You've cleaned off the top surface of the lower manifold. You have 2 raised dowels on here that are going to basically give you the right location. It's going to hold the gasket in place, and then the manifold itself is going to click onto those as well. If you get one that's a little stubborn, don't go hammering on the gasket. What we want to do is we'll just put a socket over it and tap that on. This way, no damage to the gasket, no damage to the dowel. Now what we're going to do is we're going to set the manifold in place. Let's pull this up because we're going to need this. This will go on your idle air control motor. Because of the way this is set up, when we put the plenum on, we're going to need to lift the front. It's going to drop in. We'll line it up with the front dowel, lower it down, and then lock it onto that dowel. And then from there, once we put the bolts in and lock down the upper plenum, then we have to reach in the back and line up these 2 holes and run 2 bolts down through, and this will actually bolt to the back of the upper plenum. Alright, so now we're ready to put the upper plenum on. We've taken the studs out of the sides, and you can either put the studs back in after you put this in place, or you can just get some 6mm bolts, 3/4 of an inch long, and they'll work just as well. So by doing that, though, it gives us a little more freedom to move this around and get it in place. Essentially what you're going to be doing is on the back side of the manifold you have these 2 bosses that come out. These are the 2 bolt holes for the bolts that hold the top of the coil that goes over the top of this. So what we're going to do is go in at an angle and then drop it down and then move it so that it drops onto the 2 locating dowels. And once that's in place, then it's just put the bolts in and lock them down. And what I've done too is, to save a little time, you can bend this back out of the way. Here's the single bolt that we left in the manifold when we took this apart, so we can just leave it in there. And then of course it's going to go in this position. So remember, you've got also a single bolt in the back and a single bolt in the front beside the 3 long ones that you're going to torque down. So now it's just a matter of set this in place. And you may need a flashlight when you can see what you're doing. You're simply going to walk this back slowly. You can actually see how everything lines up. And make sure nothing's in the way. Feels like it's stuck. There we go. Alright, so we've got our hardware right here. We'll take our 3 bolts, drop those in. And if you can't quite get your fingers in these front and back bolts, what I've used is a tool, and I'll show you in a second, is a tool called expanding fingers, and it will grab around the head bolt and you can actually run it down, spin it in, and then come in with a socket extension and ratchet to torque it down. Alright, so you can see what the tool does. It'll actually hold the bolt on the end. It gives you access into a deeper area right here. And you just run your finger down so you feel for the hole. And by grabbing the head of the bolt, you can actually use the tool to spin it in until you feel it seat down. And we'll just do the rest with the socket. And we'll do the same with the front bolt. Slip down in there. Alright. Alright. So we'll get a 10mm socket, extension and ratchet, and we'll torque those down. Alright, so there is no torque spec listed in Land Rover's overhaul manual specifically for these bolts. They have a general chart. 8mm bolts, they recommend you torque to 13 foot-pounds. I think that's a little bit on the loose side. I don't have an exact torque spec to recommend, but basically what I essentially do is rung them until they're snug and then just give them just a little twist just to add some tension. Let them sit for a couple seconds and then go back and start from the middle, and we'll go around twice just to make sure everything is tight and even. Alright, so now at this point we have this torqued down. Now's a good time. What we're going to do is we're going to connect the throttle body heater hoses. Remember, we have this long one over here. This is going to go across, because once you put your alternator and your AC compressor back in, it's kind of tough to get them in there, so we'll do those then. You also have your PCV breather hose right here. That's going to go onto this spigot. You want to check this black spigot or nipple on these, because these have a tendency to loosen up, so you want to make sure you snug that in. You don't want any vacuum leaks there. And of course, plug in. This is the vacuum line over to your brake booster. You're going to plug that in. And then what you have right here is the one heater hose that has the hole for a bolt, or where the stud was, through the side. And you're going to reattach that. And then your other heater hose tube will lay up over the top. We're going to put a new bolt in there. So that's essentially, we're just going to hook up all the ancillaries. We've also got for your emission controls. You have your control solenoid here. This is going to plug into the throttle body, and then your connector for your idle air motor. So all that gets connected to this upper plenum, and then we can go on to the next step. But the first one and the fun part is getting those two bolts for the coil to the manifold lined up, because you're essentially going to do that by feel. And what you can do is you can move this big harness a little more out of the way so you can get your hand down in there. And the rest is pretty much done by feel. And this is why we leave the bottom bolts a little loose on that coil mount, so that we can rock this back and forth and eventually get the hole lined up and get the bolts started. It'll take a little patience, a little time, but you'll get it. Alright, so here's a good example. If you find yourself having a hard time getting that bolt lined up, if you can get like I have an expanding mirror that I can use in the back, any mirror will work. But what you can do then is angle it down so you can get a look at why you're not able to line up. And you'll see, like on this one, what we've got to do is be able to move that bracket forward, and I didn't quite leave it loose enough on the bottom to do that. So what we do is we take a little pry bar and then we just gently move it back a little bit. And now we know, we can see the holes are lined up. And we'll put a bolt in there and get that locked down. Alright, and then what we're going to do next is put the throttle and the cruise control cable hook up on here, because these two bolts, at least one of them, is sort of covered by the AC compressor. So we're going to put that all this way. The whole upper plenum is all together by the time we're ready to put our two ancillaries on and our idler pulleys. So you got two 8mm head bolts here. We'll hook up that bracket. We'll just sort of snug it. And then what you'll need to do is go to full open throttle. You'll see a little slot in the top there. We'll slide the barrel in and then line up the slot to pop it fully in place, just to make sure it's in there completely. There we go. So you should be able to swivel that little barrel in there, so then you know you're in properly. And then the same thing with the cruise control. Slide that over so it lines up with the groove. Popped in. Alright, and you should just have some slight tension on there. Should have just a little bit of free play on that, not much. So now we'll just get a 8mm socket, tighten that up, and we'll have everything together on the plenum. Alright, so just a quick review on the upper plenum because we want to make sure. So we've tightened down the 4 bolts up top, one in the back, one in the front for a total of 6. You have your connection here for your idle air motor. You have your connection here for your emission control. This is for the evap system. This is the purge valve. So you have your electrical connection, and then you have your hose connection right here. This is just a pop-in. Your breather hose, and your throttle position sensor. You've got your connector up in here. So we're good there. Your 2 heater hoses to the throttle body heater. And they're on nice and snug, and they're in the back. And then of course your 2 bolts, and then we just showed you how to put the throttle cables on. And we'll go around to the other side and we'll do a quick review on that. Alright, and then on the passenger side, of course we have the breather hose is connected and this clamp is on. We've plugged in our vacuum line that feeds our brake vacuum booster. Our 2 heater hoses, we have the bolt in on top that locks the 2 brackets of the hoses, the metal hoses, together, along with the single bolt down. Now I'm going to make a note on this, that on these engines without secondary air, there's a spacer that goes between this hose bracket and the upper plenum. And you would have found that when you took it off. Sometimes after these vehicles, if they've been worked on once before, somebody didn't put that spacer back in, just a couple flat washers works just fine. So that's in place. And then of course, everything else lines up here. Now you'll see too, and this is kind of a neat trick, you can actually take a razor knife and cut this rubber connector for these 2 hoses, though you don't need to. Alright, but just a note. And then what we're going to do then is, you can see we have some exposed wire down here that I really don't like. We're going to get some plastic convolute to go over the top of that before we attach everything to this bracket. And then we're ready to put the AC compressor and the alternator on. Alright, so next step was what we're going to do. We're going to tie in the heater hose. You have there's actually a threaded hole behind this opening that's going to bolt and support this line up against the alternator mounting bracket. And then you'll see you got 2 little brackets right here. What you're going to want to use is, this is a tie strap with what they call a Christmas tree on the end of it. So you can wrap it around the wiring here and then plug the Christmas tree into that, and that'll basically hold this up in here. Now, as you can see, the old cover is falling off on this, leaving the wire insulation exposed. You see this piece right here I've installed just to cover up the wiring there. We're going to do the same with this. We're going to replace that convolute. Like I said, you can buy that in any automotive center. And then you've got your ground wire right here, and that's going to be bolted right in this position from the front. There's a threaded hole on the front of the bracket. So then that'll get this all set. So then the next step will be both the alternator and the AC compressor. So just to give you a little overall look, what we have is, our ground line is attached here. Our bracket that comes off of this hose is attached here. We replaced convolute over the exposed wiring, and then we've taken the wire ties with the Christmas trees and put them in place so that everything is essentially in its place. So now we're ready to put the alternator on. So alternator mounts on this bracket, and what you have are these sliding shoes basically that are used to install the alternator. And what they do is they actually slide within the bracket. In most cases, once you've taken the alternator out and pried it out, this one's already back in place. This one you can, I'll show you, see how it hangs out and leaves an area there. You take your hammer and just give her a tap in. And what that'll do is open up the space so the alternator will just drop in. When you tighten it up, it pulls those shoes in and locks everything in place. And the only 2 wires that you need to attach are going to be your battery feed cable and then your field wire. And you can see essentially just on the back of the alternator you've only got 2 positions, so it's kind of hard to get it wrong. And the alternator obviously is going to sit in this position. So we're going to hook our wiring up first, and then we're going to set the alternator in there. And then just as a tip, there's a lot of hardware put aside on this, and there's a lot of bigger bolts as we get towards the end as far as the hanging brackets, the plenum and whatnot. you'll notice that the two alternator bolts have this goldish tone. They're an anodized bolt. So if you're not quite sure what bolts go in the alternator, look for this gold tone on the shaft and the size of the bolt, and then those will be the correct ones for the alternator. So next is going to be the AC compressor. And as you can see, basically you just have 4 bolts up top. There is a locating dowel here which will help you get it set up and located. Now, as you remember, we didn't have to disconnect the AC lines. This has just been sitting here waiting for us to put it back together. And what I normally do is, before you slide this on, you got this back left-hand corner bolt. Always put that on first, because what's going to happen is when you get the compressor here in line, you're not going to be able to install this bolt because the throttle linkage is going to be in the way. So before you set it in, grab one of your alternator bolts, and it'll actually help you line up a little better, because that will locate in the back hole. And then you've got your dowel in the front. And now we'll just drop our 3 remaining bolts in. This one we'll obviously have to put in, tighten up with a wrench. The other 3, if you have compressed air, you can run it in with that, or just do all of them with a socket and a ratchet. Alright, so now we're going to start putting the pulleys on so we can get the belt on. Now, one thing we did notice when we got into it, this the original tensioner was binding up the two idlers. One of them felt kind of rough. So we actually offer this kit where you can get both the idler pulleys and the tensioner. If you're going to put a new motor in, you don't need any future problems. For the low cost that you can get this kit for, it's well worth putting in. You don't have to deal with a belt problem. So what we're going to do then is we're going to install these, and then we've got to put the water pump pulley on and the power steering pump, which is just a matter of line up the pulleys, put your bolts in and tighten them up. But just so you know, you'll see that the 2 idlers are of different sizes. The smaller pulley is going to be mounted here, so you're going to want to put the tensioner on first and then the small pulley, and then your large pulley is going to be located right here. And then at that point we'll put the other 2 on. Alright, so here's what the pulleys look like installed. Like I said, small one on the bottom, big one up top. And then you want to give a little test spin just to make sure they're seated properly. Okay, so it spins, got a little bit of resistance, which is good. That's a nice tight bearing. And then the tensioner, and then you always want to look in the back and make sure that the back of this is seated flat. There's a locating pin that drops in, so you're going to slide that pin in to the hole in the back side of the bracket, and then just move this up until your bolt drops in, tighten it up, and you're good. Alright, so next is going to be water pump pulley and power steering pulley. Alright, before you put the power steering pulley on, and I've seen it done because it can be mounted in either direction. So what you're going to do is basically look at the pulley, and you're going to see the imprint of the, I guess I would call the triangle or the pyramid, which is the surface that's going to ride on the pump itself. You'll see the imprint on one side, on the other you won't. So obviously then this is the proper side to install against the power steering pump. There is a difference in the offset, so if you do install it backwards, the belt's not going to line up right. So you want to make sure you see that imprint. And then on the water pump pulley, you will see where there are marks on the bolt holes where the original bolts went, so you just want to reuse those, because this way you know everything's going to line up right. So on the water pump pulley, what I like to do is I'll turn this so that I've got one threaded hole straight up, so I have an orientation, because once I go to slide the pulley over, I can't see those. So I'll set that bolt right in place and sort of line it up, and then just roll it around a little bit until that bolt lines right up. Slide this up over the hub and put the other 2 on. Now these don't require a great amount of torque. You can actually, when you go to tighten these, you can actually get your hand wrapped around that pulley and be able to tighten it. Again, look for the tripod, point that straight up. And it lines itself right up. Alright, so then we just put the last remaining 2 bolts in, and then we get everything tightened up. Alright, so now comes the fun part. We're going to put the belt on. If you didn't take a picture before you took it apart to give you an idea of how it's routed, this is the best way to go about it. We're going to hold basically the belt like so, and we've done a sag or a loop in the center, and that loop is going to go around the power steering pulley. Okay. And then we're going to go up and over the AC compressor. And we're going to go up and over the alternator, around the tensioner, And at this point, we're not going to worry about that little pulley, and you'll see why in a minute. And we'll go under the crankshaft pulley, up and over power steering pulley, and around this larger idler. And sometimes you got to slide it off to get it out. So what that essentially does, it gets everything in place. Now, of course, rib side of the belt will always be on the ribbed pulleys. So you have alternator, AC compressor, power steering pump, lower damper, and tension are all ribbed, so you should have rib side on there. Now what we do is we take our wrench. Now this is a different size than the original with this kit. Originally you'd have a 15 millimeter here, but they have stepped up to a 16 millimeter. Put that up, then when we push down, we're simply going to just give us enough room to slide that belt up and over the little pulley. And then before you take allow all the tension on there, just a quick feel to make sure that the belt is fully seated and all the other pulleys let up, and there you are, belt's in place. So next step then is going to be putting the fan shroud and the fan on and your upper radiator hose. Alright, so very important, we don't want to forget the dipstick. Now these use a very high vacuum PCV system, as well as emission control is also incorporated on there. So literally any vacuum leak can create a drivability issue on these. So when I put the dipstick in, I'm going to actually run a bead of black RTV right around the base of this knurl. This is what seats down on the block or when we insert this. And this way, by the time we actually get to the point where we're ready to start it, this will pretty well be set up, so we know we got a good seal. So that's really all we're going to do. Just throw a little black RTV on that. Take our finger and just run it around about the thickness of that raised area. And then we're just going to basically slide it right down the hole. Let's move that out of the way. See your hole right there. And it'll slide right in, and then you have a threaded hole right here on the side of the valve cover. When you flip this up, this is going to line right up with it. Right there. And then once we run that screw in there, let that RTV set up, we'll be all set, and then we can actually put our dipstick right inside the tube. Alright, then of course you want to plug in your AC compressor. You got your gray plug connector right here. Just push that in till you hear the click. And just put this down where it's really not rubbing against anything too severely. And then we just have the one wire here for the mass airflow sensor. We'll put that to the side. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to put the lower shroud in for the fan. There's two clips that attach on the bottom, and then two Phillips screws on each side here that are going to hold that, lock that down. And then the fan, and then the upper shroud, and then the well, actually it's going to be the lower shroud, the fan, and we're going to do the radiator hose. One thing I want to mention on these, the thermostat. If you take a good look right here, top of the thermostat has two outlets. One goes off at about a 40-degree angle, one points straight up. They're both the same size, and I have seen where somebody could actually install it with this reversed, which will actually cause an overheating problem. So you want to make sure that the angled outlet goes to the lower hose, which goes down to the water pump, and the straight up is going to go to the upper radiator hose, which also attaches here and here. But just keep that in note. So the angled to the water pump, straight up to the upper radiator. Alright, so we put our shroud in place. We got two Phillips screws. We grab the bottom, we pull out, make sure that those tabs on the bottom are holding it in place. And we just slide the fan in. And we try to get it as square as possible. Usually what I do is just the back of my hand up against the front of the fan clutch. And if you work it real slow, eventually you'll hit a spot where it'll feel like the threads will catch. And then from there you can just spin it on. Alright, so I've put the upper hose in place, but I want to show you basically how it should look when it's installed. So you have your bleeder cap right here. You're joined here at that front tube, upper radiator, and then of course down on the thermostat. Clamps are in place, and you want to make sure you can feel that bulb, that little bulge at the end of the nipples that you attach these to, and they're there so that with the clamp behind it, there's no chance of it coming off. All right, it's just a little security measure they build into these. So you just want to make sure the clamp is below or behind that bulge so that you know you've got it in the proper position. All right, so essentially we're ready at this point. We've got to just put the top cover on, which is 4 screws that only you turn them 90 degrees and they're in. And then we'll put the air filter and the hose in, and then we can put on our final coolant line, which is the overflow or the vent line that goes across into the expansion tank. Okay, actually what we're going to do is we're going to put the vent line on now, because this cover actually goes over the top of it. You see these 2 raised areas right here actually is the channel that this is going to rest in. Kind of acts as a sort of a support. And we'll just push that on there. And what I would suggest is if this hose feels brittle at all, in other words, if you can't take it and flex it like that, it feels like it's going to crack and split, replace it, because more than likely that's exactly what it's going to do very soon. And you certainly don't want to risk your new engine and all your work on a relatively inexpensive hose. Same thing with anything else wearable on the engine. If you're going to put the time and money to put a new engine on, if the old hoses feel dried out, put new hoses on it. I've done that with every engine I've put in. New hoses, new belt, anything basically rubber and flexible. It's not worth the risk. It's worth a little extra money for the security of knowing you've got a good system in there. So we'll set that in there, set that in there. We lift up, and of course the rounded end towards the fan, and we'll bounce it around a little bit so it lines up. And you'll see the cutout on the side there is for that hose. And we got 1 screw missing on this one. And what you do is you back it off a little bit, you'll feel it pop, and then just turn 90 degrees. And you'll actually feel the screw come to a stop when it seats in. There we go. And just squeeze that upper hose a little bit and pop that right in place. So we're pretty much assembled there. And now we just need to hook up the intake tube and the air filter assembly. Alright, just to make it easier now, of course the air filter, you pulled it out, so you got the idea. It's basically a pop-in. What I like to do is I shoot a little silicone spray on those rubber sets that it goes into. And just make it slide in a little bit easier and less probability of having an accident and breaking one. Because the rubber, they'll split, they dry up a little bit. And a little maneuvering here and there. You can actually see the 2 on the front, and you can see that just popped right in, so that's perfect. Put your clamps aside for that. So we have the little elbow goes in next. And that just slides over the top of that boot, and then you have the 2 screws. Pull that away from the body just a little bit. There's the air filter box in place. We've got the elbow for the cold air induction, 2 little nuts that hold that in place, so you get a view of what that looks like in. So then we're going to put our air filter in. When you do this, you can see that you essentially have a top seal, and that's going to go, we don't want to tuck that under, we want that sitting right on top of that ledge that goes all the way around the filter. So then when we put the cover on, we've got a good seal all the way around to reduce the amount of debris or anything that'll get pulled up through the filter. This gets clipped on, and we lower that. And push it forward till it drops in. And you have a side clip and you have a top clip. So air filter's on, and next we do our induction tube. Alright, so we've got hose in place. right? Your idle air control motor, throttle body, air filter. So your clamps just go on the front side. Gonna need to squeeze that radiator hose in a little bit. Pop that in so we got a good seal. And of course for our mass airflow sensor, and again you push this in till you actually hear that click so you know you're in solid. So then we just have clamp here to tighten, and then this has got the factory squeeze clamp on it. We'll just grab that with a pair of pliers and you squeeze together till it clicks, and our air tube will be on. Alright, so now we're at the point we're ready to put fluids in. We want to get oil and coolant in this. So let's start with the oil. So again, we're back underneath the vehicle. We're going to put the oil filter on. Now what I usually recommend is, because what happens when you first start this up, you've got basically a dry engine. Of course, most of the parts are protected with assembly oil, but what will happen is when you first fire it up, it doesn't last very long. So we're going to fill the oil filter about halfway with 1040 conventional oil, which is what we're going to use in the vehicle. We prefer to use the conventional. It's old school engine basically, so it likes the old school oil. I really don't recommend synthetics for this. So we'll put the put a little oil in the oil filter, probably about half a bottle. Let it absorb into the filter a bit. What that will do is reduce the amount of time that this needs to build up pressure, so that we get almost immediate pressure. We are going to do an initial crank, no start, so that we can get the pump operating. We're going to do that by removing the fuel pump relay, and then this way it won't start up on it, but it is going to crank around and develop oil pressure, and that we'll show you how to do that in a few minutes. So for now, we'll get the filter on, and then we have the plastic splash pan to go on underneath this yet, and we'll be ready to drop it and fill it up with oil. Alright, so don't forget to put your plastic shield back up in there. Now over the years of the Discovery 2, there's some of the shields you have a full shield, there was a half shield, there's a quarter shield. So whatever shield came with it, it's nice to put a splash guard underneath the vehicle. So we'll get a couple screws started, and then we'll get the rest of them in, and we'll lower this back down and start filling her up. Alright, so before we hook the battery up, on your fuse box cover under the hood you actually have identifying icons to show you what's what. So if we look at it, we're looking at it this way, we're looking at it this way. The very last one on the bottom row closest to the fuses is the fuel pump relay by the sign of the gas pump. So pull that relay right out of there, and then this way the fuel pump won't fire off, and we're going to crank this around at least 3 segments at 15 seconds each. Get a little oil circulated in the system, so when we initially start it up, we really don't want to run anything dry. So what I've done is I've done 2 15-second cranks to get some oil pressure going. I'm going to do a couple more, but before I do, so if we do 2, the starter's going to get a little warm, so we're going to let the starter cool down for a second. While we're doing that, we'll take the air bleed off. We're going to top off the tank. You're going to see the coolant continue to drop for a while, and then we'll get to a point where we can get this started. We get some coolant circulated through, and then we'll go through the bleed process to get all the air out. So we're going to turn the key on and off several times, because when you first turn the key on cold, it will activate the fuel pump to pressurize the system. So being the system's been laying empty, we're going to do that 2 or 3 times to develop fuel pressure. Got a gas on this thing. Alright, so for the final bleed, what we're going to do is we've topped off the coolant, we have oil pressure, vehicle's running, we're going to let it warm up a little bit. We're going to turn the heat on full and out of the registers on the dash. And what we're going to end up doing is, as the vehicle warms up, once we develop some heat and the thermostat opens, we're going to bring engine RPM up to about 2,500 RPM. For one, it helps to seat the rings. Two, once we develop heat coming out of the dash, if you take your foot off the gas and it goes to idle and you feel the heat dissipate or go back to cold, we've got air in the system. So we want to keep doing, we're going to do this on and off until at idle we have heat coming out of the registers. Then we know that we've got all the air out of the system. Alright, so as you can see, we're all bled out. We've got oil pressure. It runs nice and smooth. We've now added a lot more life to our 99 to 2004 Discovery 2. So when you're ready to do the same to yours, just give a call to any of our knowledgeable salesmen at 1-800-533-2210. Or if you like, you can click online and you can order it online if you wish. Or you can go to our YouTube website and subscribe to that and look at all of our other videos we've done to show you how to maintain your Land Rover. So, when you're ready to do so, we thank you for watching, and Rover on.